For my money, Moneyball is the greatest sports movie of all time. No pun intended. The story of how the 2002 Oakland Athletics, without the budget to compete against the best teams in baseball, and with no payroll to speak of, somehow built an incredible team that set the American League record for the longest winning streak and ended up making the playoffs against all odds, was an incredible movie. And even if parts may have been historically inaccurate, the movie is one of my all-time favorites across any genre. And I bring this anecdote up because there's one particular quote in the movie that might be one of the greatest quotes uttered in any sports movie, as it is a quote that rings true in life with everything. At one point, a scout says, "We're all told at some point in time that we can no longer play the children's game. We just don't know when that's going to be. Some of us are told at 18. Some of us are told at 40. But we're all told." In other words, this profound quote is another way of saying that Father Time is undefeated. Nobody can play this sport forever. Nobody can spend their entire life playing athletics. Eventually, your body breaks down. Eventually, you're not good enough. Eventually, you become slow, or the skill gap between you and the competition is substantial, or you become unable to do the things you were once able to do with ease at some point. Eventually, you've got to hang it up. Everyone's got to retire at some point and call it quits. There is not a single player in NFL history that died of natural causes and played professional football until the day he died. There just isn't. It's not possible. And most of the time, when a player has this realization and decides, after a long and storied career, to call it quits and hang it up, it takes place at the end of the season. By nature, most of these athletes are competitors and have a competitive spirit. They want to finish what they started, especially because the games are the fun part. The off-season conditioning and the part where they survive training camp is the part that they're not looking forward to at all. Think of all the great players in football history, and most of them have something in common. They retired at the end of their final season. Sure, the timeline might be different on some of them. Some athletes might do a farewell tour and make it clear that this is their final season. Others might announce their retirement in October, but play out the rest of the season. And others might wait until June or July to formally announce that they're hanging it up. But 99.9% of the time, when a player retires, excluding a catastrophic, almost life-threatening or life-altering injury, they're not doing it while they're on the roster in October or November. You're just not going to go through all that hard work in the offseason of making the team and busting your butt to get into shape just to call it quits in Week 11. However, when you know, you know. And sometimes, the realization becomes so strong and the play becomes so embarrassing and below the standards of that individual that the player in question decided to retire in the middle of the season. The player just decides that he's going to walk away from the sport in the heart of the campaign, with no grand fanfare or anything along those lines. We saw this in 2018 with Buffalo Bills cornerback and two-time Pro Bowler Vontae Davis, who left this world way too soon earlier this year at the age of 35. During a Week 2 game against the Los Angeles Chargers, Davis realized, in the middle of the action, that he just didn't have it anymore. He had nothing left to give. And with that, in the middle of the game, he retired. Said Davis on the decision that now lives on throughout NFL history, and is almost what the man is known for, "I went to the bench, and it just hit me. I don't belong on that field anymore. I didn't feel right. I didn't feel like myself. I left everything the league wanted me to be. Playing for my teammates while injured, the gladiator mentality, it all just popped. And when it popped, I just wanted to leave it all behind." We also saw this in 1984 with New Orleans Saints quarterback and future Hall of Famer Ken Stabler, who, after a horrible performance on national television against the Dallas Cowboys, decided to retire in the middle of the season, realizing that he didn't have it anymore and had nothing left to give to this game. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Now, there is some debate even today about Stabler and Davis and whether they quit on their teams or not. But regardless of whether you think they quit and should have finished what they started, or had every right to bow out on their own terms, you can't deny the fact that they just knew. Their body was telling them that they couldn't wait to call it quits. Their bodies didn't operate on that nice football calendar. They were broken right then and there, and that was it. No more. No mas. And I bring all of that up because while you probably know about Vontae Davis and you probably know about Ken Stabler, especially if you've been a longtime watcher of this channel, you probably don't know about the one we're going to talk about today. Unlike Stabler and Davis, this man retired in the second half of the season, where we were closer to the end of the year than the start of it, and where the light was at the end of the tunnel. Unlike Stabler and Davis, this man retired while playing for a playoff team, and one of the best teams in the NFL, foregoing a chance at the Super Bowl in the process. But just like Stabler and Davis, this man knew that when he was done, and that was it. Because this man right here is Los Angeles Raiders wide receiver Bob Chandler. And in the middle of the 1982 season, in essence, he retired. He told the coaching staff that he was done. He told the coaching staff that he couldn't play anymore. And he told the coaching staff to put him out of his misery because his playing days were over. And this is the story behind the great Bob Chandler and the bizarre end to his career, where the man quit on the Raiders and retired in the middle of the season. Before I get on with the video and talk about the man who played for these two teams behind me right here in the Bills and the Raiders, we talk on this channel all the time about the weird and wacky history of the NFL. And if you like that sort of stuff, and you like this documentary style, then this is the place to be. So be sure to hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post, because we post every single day about the National Football League. Thanks in advance for your support. When you think of the greatest receivers of the 1970s and the early 1980s, odds are the man who we're about to talk about today is not one of them. He's not in that top tier of guys in the same way that you consider players like Drew Pearson, Lynn Swann, Cliff Branch, or John Stallworth to be. However, make no mistake about it, Bob Chandler was an awfully good player who was an awfully consistent and reliable receiver who could be counted on for over a decade to play at a high level in the National Football League. Chandler was drafted in the 7th round of the 1971 NFL Draft by the Buffalo Bills, back at a time when no one expected 7th round picks to contribute much of anything. Of the 26 players drafted in the 7th round, 12 of them, so roughly half of them, didn't even so much as play a single down in the NFL. But despite Chandler's late draft status, he went on to have one of the most productive and successful careers of any player in the class, etching his name as an important part of NFL history all these years later. For the first 9 seasons of Chandler's career, he was a member of the team that drafted him, the Buffalo Bills. And while Chandler was with Buffalo, he established himself as one of the best and most consistent receivers in the history of that franchise, as across those 9 years, he amassed 295 receptions for 3,999 yards, just 1 yard off of that 4,000 career yard mark, and he had 34 touchdowns, ending his tenure with Buffalo second all-time in franchise history in receiving yards, second all-time in franchise history in receiving touchdowns, and by one measly catch, first all-time in franchise history in receptions. Most notable for Chandler was an incredible 3-year stretch from 1975 to 77, where few receivers across the NFL were better than he was, and I do not say that lightly. In 1975, he had 55 receptions for 746 yards and 6 touchdowns. His 55 catches ranked 5th in the entire NFL, and he was one of just 2 players that season to have at least 55 catches and 6 touchdowns, with the other one being a running back in Minnesota Vikings player Chuck Foreman. For an encore in 1976, Chandler had 61 receptions for 824 yards and 10 touchdowns, finishing second in the entire NFL in receptions, only behind Kansas City Chiefs running back MacArthur Lane, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Not only did Chandler also finish 6th in receiving yards, but he also finished 3rd in receiving touchdowns. You could make the legitimate argument that in 1976 at least, for that 1 year, Bob Chandler was the best receiver in all of football. At minimum, he was the most productive guy out there. Buffalo was absolutely terrible during the 1976 season, finishing the season with a 2-12 record and looking like the worst non-expansion team in football. But if there was one bright spot, and if there was one player that made the Bills that season semi-watchable, it was Bob Chandler himself. And for another encore in 1977, Chandler had 60 receptions for 745 yards and 4 touchdowns, once again finishing second in the NFL in receptions, only behind Baltimore Colts running back Lydell Mitchell. Speaking of finishing second, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the fact that by the time Bob Chandler's career officially ended, he ended it, you guessed it, second in his draft class in receiving touchdowns. Oddly enough, the man who finished ahead of him was the man taken 1 pick after he was, when with pick number 181, the Philadelphia Eagles chose wide receiver and future Hall of Famer Harold Carmichael. It's really bizarre because 7th-round picks usually don't do anything, especially back then. And yet, in 1971, we had back-to-back wide receivers taken in pick 180 and pick 181, who went on to have incredible NFL careers by any and every metric. Chandler had back-to-back seasons in the mid-70s where he was second in the league in catches behind a running back. And truly, from 1975 to 77, even though Chandler was never recognized with any Pro Bowl honors or All-Pro recognition, he was more productive than anyone else in the game. In those 3 years, Chandler had 176 catches, which was the second most in football, only behind Lydell Mitchell, who, again, was a running back. If we're just looking at catches from wide receivers, then not only was Chandler number 1, but no one was even in the same stratosphere as him, as the next closest receiver, and the only receiver to have 150, or 50 per season, was Dallas Cowboys wideout and future Hall of Famer Drew Pearson, who had 152. Chandler had 24 more catches than the second closest wide receiver. Over that 3-year stretch, Chandler was 6th in the NFL in receiving yards with 2,315 yards. 3 of the 5 guys ahead of him are currently in the Hall of Fame. And over that 3-year stretch, Chandler was 5th in the NFL in receiving touchdowns with 20, only behind Cliff Branch, Ken Burrow, Mel Gray, and Lynn Swann. Some really good company to be in. Bottom line, Bob Chandler was really good, and you can make the legitimate argument that alongside guys like Marcus Colston and Wayne Corbett, that Bob Chandler is the greatest receiver in NFL history to never make the Pro Bowl. At the very least, he belongs in the conversation. As one writer said on Chandler, when he played in Buffalo, future Hall of Fame running back O.J. Simpson wore the blue and white of the Bills. But he didn't belong to them. Not really. In truth, the juice belonged to the country. He was the NFL. Buffalo was, instead, Bob Chandler's town. These were his fans. The Bills were Bob Chandler's Bills. Bob Chandler lived right downtown, among the fans and the natives. He mingled with them. Buffalo, to be sure, admired the juice, but it adopted Chandler, mainly because it identified with him. To Buffalo, he represented the average working man, out scrambling for a living and a buck. That was who Bob Chandler was. He was a bright spot during some dark times in the 1970s. He was a hard-working, incredible player who, considering the lack of notoriety the Bills got during that period, felt like one of the best-kept secrets in the NFL. But after 9 seasons in Buffalo, Chandler found himself on the opposite side of the country for the 1980 season, after he was traded to the Oakland Raiders in exchange for four-time Pro Bowl linebacker Phil Villapiano, with Chuck Knox, the new head coach in Buffalo, wanting to do what he could to bolster his defense. And as great as Villapiano was in Oakland, serving the Raiders as one of the best linebackers of the 1970s, and being a key part as to why they dominated in 1976 and ended up winning Super Bowl 11 over the Minnesota Vikings, in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, Al Davis had to be thanking his lucky stars that he was able to swing a trade for Bob Chandler. Not that Chandler's career was on the downswing by any means, far from it, but it got a second wind of sorts once he got to Oakland, because now, the man who felt like the best kept secret in the NFL throughout the 1970s was no longer a secret. In 1980, his first season with the Raiders, Chandler made an immediate impact, hauling in 49 catches for 786 yards and 10 touchdowns. Chandler's ability to find the end zone made him an important part of Oakland's offense, and allowed him to finish the season second in the league in receiving touchdowns, only behind John Jefferson of the San Diego Chargers, who had 13. Chandler led the Raiders in receptions, and the 1-2 punch at wide receiver of he and Cliff Branch proved to be one of the most unstoppable wide receiving units in all of football. But whereas in the 70s, his production on the Bills came in a ton of losing efforts for a bad team, things were different in 1980, because his production was helping the Raiders win. It was not all for nothing. Chandler helped the Raiders make the playoffs, and then helped them make it to their third Super Bowl in franchise history, where they played at Super Bowl 15 against the Philadelphia Eagles. Then, the Raiders won it all, taking it 27-10, and a big reason why they did so was the play of this man right here, Bob Chandler, who had 4 catches for 77 yards, both of which were the second best total on the team. Jim Plunkett had a great day at quarterback for the Raiders during their championship win, and a big reason for that was because Bob Chandler was making plays down the field, catching 3 first down passes longer than 15 yards. I don't want to say that without Bob Chandler, the Raiders don't win the Super Bowl on that day, because with how well Rod Martin played on defense, they were going to win the big game. However, with Bob Chandler on the roster in 1980 in general, the Raiders do not find themselves in that position. That trade saved their season. Just like that, Bob Chandler was on top of the world. After an incredible season by his standards and by the team's standards, the world knew of Bob Chandler as one of the top receivers in football, and the longtime underappreciated and underrespected man was now a household name. And even in 1981, when he missed some time due to a spleen injury, and when the Raiders did not play all that sharp, he still played well, relatively speaking, leading the Raiders in receiving touchdowns and averaging well over 40 yards per game. The difference in the offense when he was on the field versus when he wasn't on the field was like night and day. But the funny thing about football, and the funny thing about life, is that it doesn't work on a bell curve. It doesn't work on a gradual slope where you slowly but surely decline in certain things. Sometimes, it just happens all at once. Sometimes, you just wake up one day and you can't do it anymore. One day, you're on top of the world and looking like one of the most consistent and formidable receiving threats in football. The next, your body can't move the way it used to. In January of 1981, Bob Chandler was one of the best receivers in the game and was a Super Bowl champion, being a massive contributor on a championship team. Not even 2 years later, it would all come crashing down, and there was nothing that he could do about it. It's no secret that the 1982 season was a rather tumultuous one around the National Football League. In particular, when you think of the 1982 season, you think of the absolute chaos surrounding it with the strike, resulting in the first ever work stoppage in NFL history that impacted regular season games. I'm not going to dive too much into the details of the strike, since it doesn't have anything to do with this video, and Chandler wasn't one of the reps for the NFLPA or anything like that where this impacted his career. But it's just to give some context around the time frame we're working with, and that everything changed in 1982. Heck, a ton of aspects of life changed in 1982. It felt like the year of change. In October of 1981, you were watching Oakland Raider football on Sundays. You didn't have cable television, and you didn't have a home computer. In October of 1982, you maybe had a computer with the Commodore 64. MTV was all the rage, and you maybe had cable. And football wasn't on TV because of the strike. And if it was, the Raiders wouldn't be in Oakland anymore, but rather would be in Los Angeles. Long story short, 1982 was a year of change in more ways than one. And it was definitely a year of change for Bob Chandler. The expectation surrounding this man right here was the same as it had always been. Come back, stay healthy, and play at a high level. Sure, the man was going to be 33 years old and was going to be entering his 13th season in the league, but there was still a lot that he wanted to do, not the least of which was win another championship. Another Vince Lombardi trophy would sound awfully nice. For starters, he had 370 receptions for his career. Get 30 more, and you get to 400, which is not only a nice round number, but is something that, at the time, fewer than 35 individuals had ever accomplished. Rack up 757 yards, which is less than what he had in 1980, so more than attainable, and you get to 6,000 yards for your career, which again is not only a nice round number, but is something that, at the time, fewer than 50 individuals had ever accomplished. Heck, if you can find the end zone just 2 more times, something that came so easy to Chandler, and you hit 50 receiving touchdowns, which is not only a nice round number, but it's something that fewer than 40 individuals had ever accomplished. By this point in his career, we knew that Bob Chandler would probably not be going down as one of the all-time greats. He was not in that tier 1 of guys like Drew Pearson and John Stallworth. But he was so close to those milestones, and even if he never publicly said it, he knew that if he hit those, that history would be extremely kind to him. In many ways, and in no way whatsoever am I saying Chandler is a Hall of Famer, or would have been if he hit those numbers, but it's similar to Cincinnati Bengals cornerback Ken Riley, where he never got the recognition he deserved in his heyday, never made the Pro Bowl, and didn't get the All-Pro nominations for a large portion of his career. But he hit various milestones that treated him incredibly favorably throughout history, and despite his lack of recognition at the time he was playing, history treated him incredibly kind, to the point where he currently resides in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, forever enshrined in the halls of Canton, Ohio. Chandler had some things to prove, and it seemed like entering 1982, he was showing no signs of slowing down. Heck, even despite missing some time in 1981 with a spleen injury, since joining the Raiders, he was still 9th in the NFL in receiving touchdowns over that 2-year time frame. And especially since the Raiders did not draft a single wideout in the first 10 rounds of the draft, choosing to address other positions even despite Chandler's age, the expectation was the same as always for Chandler. And the expectation, quite simply, was that he would contribute. However, as you might have been able to guess, that did not happen. At least, not initially. It started during training camp when he suffered not 1, but 2 injuries in quick succession. After pulling his groin earlier in the week but shaking it off, he twisted his knee, presumably trying to contort his body into staying in bounds on a catch. Said head coach Tom Flores on the injury, he had his feet planted when it happened, and he twisted it. However, Flores downplayed the injury, thinking that it would not be anything serious. As Flores said, fortunately, he went down right away instead of trying to run on it right away. There wasn't any swelling, and the pain went away quickly. Turns out, while Tom Flores was great at a lot of things, and is a Hall of Fame coach for a reason, He was not great at being a doctor and evaluating injuries, because this was a bit more than a twist, as it ended up being a dislocated thigh bone. As one writer said on Chandler's injury, not just the thigh, but the groin from earlier in camp and the spleen from 1981, along with a few injuries he sustained in Buffalo, Bob Chandler's value to the Raiders can't be overestimated, but age and nagging injuries may be catching up with him. The injury not only kept Chandler out for the remainder of the preseason, but kept him out for the first 2 weeks of 1982. It wasn't anything super serious in the grand scheme of things, and he would have been back before November if, there was football being played before November. But the 2-month-long strike kind of made things wonky and weird and unusual, in case you haven't figured that out by now. Still, when Chandler came back on the field and recovered fully from his injury, it was during the team's 5th game of the season against the Seattle Seahawks. I should note that according to reports and everything that I could find, Chandler wasn't hurt for the first 2 games after the strike, and he could have played. He just didn't factor into the game plan necessarily that week. But for this game right here against Seattle, the plan was to get him involved. And it would be nice if the Raiders could find a way to get him involved. The passing game for the Raiders had been sort of stagnant since the strike. In their 3rd game against the San Diego Chargers on Monday Night Football, starting quarterback Jim Plunkett only had 145 net passing yards and threw more interceptions than touchdowns. And in their 4th game against the Cincinnati Bengals, a 31-17 loss and their first loss of the season, the Raiders once again struggled in the passing department, with Jim Plunkett throwing 4 interceptions. Clearly, Plunkett and Chandler have a strong connection with each other. They don't have that incredible 1980 season without it. If the two of them could get on the same page in this game and help the Raiders avoid losing 2 straight, then that would help Los Angeles out tremendously. Now, the good news was that the Raiders were able to get back in the win column and defeat the Seahawks, taking the game by a final score of 28-23, even if they had to clench their teeth a bit more than they would have liked, seeing as the Raiders led it 28-0 at one point and led it 28-7 entering the 4th quarter before Seattle scored the final 23 points of the game, including 16 in the 4th, and made things far more interesting than anyone thought. And there were many reasons why the Raiders won this game. From the 2 interceptions by Burgess Owens, who was a menace in the secondary and gave Jim Zorn fits all game long, to a secondary in general that broke up a crap ton of passes and gave the receivers no cushion whatsoever, with Zorn going just 16 for 45, completing only 35% of his passes with 3 interceptions and 4 sacks, to great coverage on one of the best receivers in NFL history in Steve Largent, as he was held to just 2 catches for 11 yards, making it one of the quietest games of his career, to a great performance by rookie running back and future Hall of Famer Marcus Allen, who had 156 rushing yards on 6.5 yards per carry and found the end zone twice. However, there was one name noticeably absent from the contributors column. There was one name that I never mentioned and that does not pop up once in these highlights. And that man was Bob Chandler, who in his first action for the 1982 season saw the field for 10 snaps and did absolutely nothing, with no catches to his name. This was the man who routinely finished near the top of the NFL in receptions just a few short years ago, and now he was blanked, completely and utterly blanked. In the coming days, Chandler would describe his performance as embarrassing. And it wasn't as though the plan was for Chandler to barely see the field and then not contribute when he was on it. It's not as though the plan for this game right here was to use Chandler as a decoy and as nothing more than a distraction for the Seahawks. The Raiders tried their best to get Chandler involved in the offense, but it just wasn't happening. It's like your super old car that used to go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, and now you're trying to do that, and it's just not happening. You wanted to, but your car won't let it happen. The team had shown no indications of being disgruntled or unhappy with Chandler and his performance. But internally, We're all pretty hard on ourselves, and on this day, Chandler knew that something wasn't right. He wasn't the man he was during his time in Buffalo, during his time with the Raiders at the start, or heck, during his time on the field just a few short months ago, despite not being in any considerable pain compared to what he used to play with, and compared to what other players go through around this time of year. The writing was starting to appear on the wall, and 1 week later, everything would change. His worst nightmare had come to fruition. His darkest dreams had come true. Bob Chandler had gotten old. December 12th, 1982. It's what is, in essence, week 6 of the strike-shortened season. And as we are into the second half of this short, somewhat shambolic season, we've got a battle on our hands at Arrowhead Stadium between two teams that are usually division rivals, but are just conference rivals this year because divisions do not exist, with the Los Angeles Raiders playing the Kansas City Chiefs. The circumstances for this game are big for the main man in our story, Bob Chandler, not just from a team perspective, but from an individual perspective. Obviously, from the team perspective, the Raiders found themselves in a very good spot to make the playoffs, as you figured that with more than half the teams making it into the postseason, that 5 wins should be good enough. It's sort of a magic number. If you can get to above 500 guaranteed, then you'll be in. And with the Raiders sitting at 4-1, a win would basically wrap up a playoff spot for them. However, a win would also put them in a fantastic spot to host a playoff game, because they didn't have a ton of margin for error with 5 other teams entering Sunday with at least 4 wins under their belt. Win this game, and you basically lock up a playoff spot and play yourself into controlling your own destiny for a home playoff game and home field. However, from the individual perspective, this game right here means the absolute world to Bob Chandler. Like I've said many times before in this video, the 1982 season had not gone according to plan for Chandler, with the injuries he suffered during the preseason, the strike, and then the disappointing outing against Seattle the previous week, where the Raiders tried their absolute best to get him involved in the game and get him on the field, but he couldn't get it done. Chandler knew that his career might be coming to an end, and he had a feeling at this point that the 1982 season was going to be his final hurrah, especially with how his body was holding up. But there was hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find that spark in this game right here and play like the Bob Chandler of old, or at the very least, a player that belonged in the NFL. And if he couldn't play like that, at least he might be able to move like that and look like he belonged on the field. Unfortunately for Chandler, the game was a mixed bag. Now, the good news is that from a team perspective, the Raiders did everything that they needed to do. It definitely was not a pretty game by any means, and it was not even the slightest bit convincing, seeing as the Raiders fumbled the ball 4 times, lost the turnover margin by 3, and averaged less than 2.5 yards per carry by picking up just 59 yards on 24 carries. However, thanks to a 35-yard touchdown pass on 3rd down with 25 seconds left on a great throw by quarterback Jim Plunkett and an even better catch by Callum Muhammad, the Raiders prevailed, and they stunned the Arrowhead Stadium crowd by a final score of 21-16. After the Raiders allowed a touchdown to fall behind 16-14 with 1:40 left, they had to drive the length of the field to find the end zone in no time at all, with Plunkett's masterful game and masterful drive being etched in Raider history as one of the greatest drives in the history of the franchise. The Raiders improved to 5-1. They all but locked up a playoff spot, and they did it in dramatic fashion against one of their biggest rivals. So you would think that this would all be good news for Chandler, right? Well, not quite. Because as you might be able to tell from these highlights of the game, for the second straight game, Chandler was held without a catch. No receptions and no yards. Nothing. His contributions in the box score were completely empty. Chandler, despite playing the last 2 games, had no catches to his name. From 1980 to 81, so the previous 2 seasons with the Raiders, he only had 1 regular season game in which he played in and failed to record a catch. That was in Week 7 of the 1981 season, where he was held off the catch column in an 18-16 win over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The last thing you expect for a guy who had 60 catches in back-to-back seasons not that long ago is for him to be held without 1 in back-to-back games. But that's what we were dealing with here. Bob Chandler, simply put, was not the same player that he once was. Once is an accident, but twice is a trend. And when you consider everything he was dealing with already this season, yeah, that's a bit more than a trend. But Chandler was on the field for an incredibly meaningful play, and it was this play that all but sealed his fate in the National Football League. Because while Bob Chandler was a receiver, he was also a holder, and would hold the ball on field goal attempts and extra points. With that, let's go to the third quarter of the contest, where the Raiders are leading 7-6, leading it by 1 point midway through the third quarter. On 4th down, the Raiders tried to extend their lead and line up for a 44-yard field goal, hoping that Chris Barr could drill it with Chandler on the hold. Instead, well, this happens.
His longest this year is 43. It's blocked. Kansas City will come up with the football.
I think it was Stan Rome who jumped up.
Now obviously, this was not Bob Chandler's fault that the kick got blocked. No one is suggesting that, and it's clear as day on the replay that the hold was perfectly fine, and Kansas City's linebacker got a perfect jump, with Barr's kick not having a ton of airtime on it whatsoever. But once the kick got blocked, watch Chandler try and make the play to fall on the loose football and prevent a Chief from taking control of it. And on this play, as Chandler tries to contort his body and dive, you can just see that he is unable to do it. That's a ball he usually falls on, and a play that he makes in his prime. Here, he couldn't react quickly enough. He couldn't extend long enough. He looked like a punter trying to make that play, not a wide receiver, and especially not a wide receiver who used to be one of the best in the game. When Chandler went to the ground and tried reaching for that football, he came to the realization that just about everyone must face at some point in life, regardless of if you're playing football or if you're living your life. The realization that, oh crap, I'm old. The realization that I'm not what I used to be, and my body is never going to get to that point again. This is the new me. This is my new life. This is it. And after the game, and after that field goal and that sad attempt by his standards to fall on the ball, but watching everyone else pass him by, Chandler told the Raiders, no more. No mas. I can't do this anymore. I'm too old. Keep in mind, Chandler didn't suffer any injuries from this play. It's not as though he pulled a muscle, or re-aggravated something, or broke something, or anything along those lines. You can see on the replay that Chandler was able to walk off the field on his own power, as if nothing had ever happened. If you were watching this game, you probably didn't even think anything of it, since there was no extended timeout. There was nothing where Chandler laid on the ground and needed the training staff, and there was nothing along those lines. He just knew as soon as he got up, I can't do this anymore. I'm not the man I used to be. And with that, in the middle of a playoff run, with nothing and no one from the outside threatening his roster status or putting him in jeopardy, Bob Chandler officially hung it up. Wednesday, December 15th, just 3 days after the Raiders win against the Chiefs, and as the team was getting ready for their next game on Saturday against their crosstown rival, the Los Angeles Rams, in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And it was on this day that they found out that if they were going to get ready to win their third straight and improve to 6-1, that they were going to have to do it without this man right here, Bob Chandler. Because on that day, Chandler went into Al Davis's office and told him, straight up, put me on IR. Put me on the injured reserve. I'm not hurt. I just know that I can't do this anymore. I'm too old. As Chandler would later tell the press, the roster spot is too valuable to waste on a guy who can't perform. If I told them I still thought I could do it, they'd have held off. But there's a time to be honest with them, and with yourself. And may I remind you in all of this, Chandler was not hurt, and the Raiders were not going to put him on IR if Chandler himself didn't go into the office and tell them to make this move. If it was up to the Raiders, Chandler would still be playing and would go out on the field on Saturday in the battle for Los Angeles. He was still a very solid holder for the team. But Chandler knew that he was done. Chandler had this feeling throughout 1982 that things were declining and that he was not the man he once was. But that blocked field goal against Kansas City changed everything, because that blocked field goal confirmed the fact that he couldn't move like a young man. Said Chandler, I'm okay when I'm making my own movements, but when I'm reacting and I have to put the knee in an awkward motion, it's no good. In other words, doing day-to-day things, he was totally fine. But actually being a football player and going up there against his peers who were younger and were in better shape than he was, not so much. As Chandler said, it's not my personality to sit and watch the other guys. It was unbelievable to me, sitting around since the first 5 days of training camp, running out on the field, and never playing. I have too much pride to be relegated to that drone role. If that play against the Chiefs hadn't happened, I'd probably keep playing until another injury took me out. It's just a matter of time. Owner Al Davis has been fantastic. He's really concerned about what's best for me, not what's best for him or the club. But there was Bob Chandler, officially being placed on IR, not because he suffered a temporary injury, but because he suffered a life realization that he was growing old. And all of this was happening as the season was winding down and the Raiders were in the playoffs. Chandler, whose job security was 100%, was passing up a chance at playing in the Super Bowl and getting another ring. Chandler was passing up a chance to keep winning some games, with the end of the season closer than the start of it, almost as though he was dropping out of the marathon after mile 23. But that was what Bob Chandler thought was best for him and the team. He thought the only way his team could win is if he pulled out of the race and dropped out for someone else. He was getting old. He was not the same guy that helped them win all those years ago. He was not the youthful man who was once one of the household names in football. He was done. Chandler watched the rest of the season on injured reserve. He watched as the Raiders went 8-1 and got the number 1 seed in the AFC. He watched as the Raiders won their first round game against the Cleveland Browns. And then, he watched as the Raiders lost their second round game against the New York Jets, in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Then, as if it wasn't official already, Chandler retired from the game, with head coach Tom Flores saying, "Even though Bob was with us a short time, he contributed tremendously to our brand of football. He helped us win a Super Bowl and was one of our leaders. I wish him well. I am sure his future is bright in law, broadcasting, or whatever." Just like that, Chandler was officially out of the NFL. 370 catches, 5,243 yards, and 48 touchdowns later, plus 1 Super Bowl later, Bob Chandler was done. The man who ended his career inside the top 50 in NFL history in receiving touchdowns at the time was done. Chandler dabbled in television for a while, working some NFL games for NBC, working as a sports reporter, and serving as the host for a couple of shows, before tragically dying on January 27, 1995, at 45 years old, from lung cancer. The following year, the Los Angeles Raiders, sans Bob Chandler, would win their third and to date final Super Bowl in franchise history when they won this game behind me right here, taking Super Bowl 18 over Washington. And Bob Chandler, I don't know what his roster status would have been in 1983, what his role would have been on the team, but I do know this much. Based on the way people talked about him, based on Tom Flores and how much he loved the man, and based on how much Al Davis loved the man, Bob Chandler, if he wanted to be on that team, would have been on that team. If he didn't retire in 1982, he had a spot with the Raiders all locked up in 1983. He could have got that second Super Bowl ring. Alas, that did not happen. The story of Bob Chandler is a story of life. In many ways, football mirrors life, and sports mirror life. And Bob Chandler's story is an example of that. There was a time when we were all in our primes. There was a time when we could seemingly do everything and anything that we wanted to, and we felt on top of the world. Heck, maybe we were on top of the world. And then, there's the realization that nothing lasts forever. Time passes. There have been billions of people who felt the same way at one point in this life, and have come and gone with the same realization that they are not what they once were. Sometimes, it's a sharp realization that you can't do this anymore. And other times, it's more gradual. But it comes for all of us at some point. Bob Chandler was sort of the same way with both a sharp realization on that field goal and the gradual realization for the entire 1982 season. And when it comes for you, and you have the cognitive ability to recognize it, you know that things are never going to be the same again. Once you know, you know. And Bob Chandler knew. He could have played another month. He could have played for the Raiders in the playoffs in the same role that he was in. And he could have played for a chance at getting a Super Bowl ring and etching his name into Raider history and NFL history even more. But that wasn't him. That wasn't what he wanted to do. He would have only been fooling himself. Everyone else wanted him around, but Chandler knew. He knew it wasn't in the best interest of himself and the team to stay in there, even if he could have won. Sometimes, we come to the realization at 9 years old that we're not good enough to play in the NFL, and that dream will never come to fruition. Sometimes, we come to that realization at 23, right out of college, that this is the end of the road. And sometimes, it happens in the middle of the season while you're on a playoff team and have done so much. Sometimes, it happens where your body tries to do something and tries to move in a way that it could have years ago, and it just can't. It just can't anymore. Because I'll go back to that quote from Moneyball. We're all told at some point in time that we can no longer play the children's game. We just don't know when that's going to be. Some of us are told at 18. Some of us are told at 40. But we're all told. And for Bob Chandler, the day was December 12th, 1982. And the person that told him, that was himself.